There's a place in the Arizona high desert where the earth remembers every bullet ever fired. Fort Iron Hawk sits 1,400 feet above sea level on a plateau of red sandstone and bleached caliche, 40 miles east of Flagstaff, where the terrain drops into a network of shallow arroyos that funnel the wind like the inside of a trumpet. The range complex stretches over 9 miles of open ground, and from the elevated firing positions along the western ridge, a shooter can see all the way to the purple rim of the painted desert on a clear morning. The air here is thin and restless. Thermals rise off the sand in visible waves that distort the horizon like warped glass, bending light around distant targets until they seem to float, dissolve, and reassemble several inches from where they actually stand. Fort Iron Hawk is not a place that forgives mistakes. It is a place that reveals exactly who you are, whether you want it revealed or not. The Global Precision Shooting Open had been held here for 11 years running, and in every single one of those years, the event had drawn the most dangerous long-range shooters on the planet. This year was no exception. 16 teams had arrived over the previous 72 hours, filling the staging area with armored transport cases, tripod-mounted spotting scopes, and portable weather stations that cost more than most civilian cars. Navy SEALs from Virginia Beach, their rifles custom-built by a contractor in Georgia who had a 2-year waiting list. Marine Scout snipers from Camp Pendleton, whose team had won the Open Division 3 of the last 5 years. A 4-man squad from the British Special Air Service who had flown in from Hereford with their own wind-reading AI, and a quiet confidence that suggested they considered winning a formality. French commandos Marine, German KSK operators who brought their own meteorological technician, an Australian SASR team whose lead shooter held the Southern Hemisphere record for confirmed long-range hits in a combat environment. Every booth in the staging tent carried flags, unit patches, and enough firepower to level a small town. The smell of gun oil and burnt coffee hung in the morning air. Range safety officers in fluorescent vests moved between the lanes, checking berms and verifying target placements with laser systems that could measure the distance to a steel plate 2 miles away down to the inch. The bleachers behind the firing line were already half full with spectators, military journalists, and a handful of Pentagon observers who had flown in on a Defense Department Gulfstream and set up their own shaded observation tent with satellite uplink and encrypted comms. Whatever happened on this range today would be watched by people who made decisions that affected the entire structure of American special operations. The registration desk was manned by a retired gunnery sergeant named Holt, a man with reading glasses perched on a sunburned nose and a clipboard that hadn't been digitized because he didn't trust anything that needed a battery. By 0700 on the first morning, he had processed all 16 teams. 40 shooters, each backed by spotters, logistics personnel, and technology that would have been classified a decade ago. Then a 47th entry appeared. Not a team, a single name on a single sheet. No unit affiliation, no club, no federation ranking, no spotter listed. No emergency contact beyond a phone number with a Chinle, Arizona area code. Holt looked at the sheet, looked up at the woman standing across his desk, looked back down at the empty fields on the form, and muttered to himself, "Well, that's a first. I'm here to register for the Open Division." The voice was calm, unhurried, and carried the flat, grounded cadence of someone who had grown up speaking Diné before English. The woman standing at Holt's desk was in her late 20s, athletic build, strong shoulders beneath a faded olive drab jacket. Her skin was a warm olive bronze, and her black hair, thick and lustrous, was divided into two long, firm braids that hung past her collarbones. Her eyes were deep dark brown, steady, with a gaze that didn't blink when Holt stared at her for 5 full seconds without speaking. She carried a single rifle case, tactical green, worn soft at the edges, like an instrument case that had traveled 100,000 miles. No secondary bag, no electronics case, no spotting scope. Holt adjusted his glasses. "Ma'am, the Open Division requires either military affiliation, a federally recognized shooting club membership, or a competition ranking from the past 2 years. I don't see any of that on your form." "Section 12, paragraph 4 of the competition bylaws," she said, sliding a printed page across the table. "Any individual may enter the Open Division by submitting a notarized skills affidavit and paying the independent entry fee. I have both. In the world of military competition shooting, protocol is everything. Rank determines who speaks first. Unit affiliation determines who commands respect. A notarized affidavit from an unknown civilian was, in the hierarchy of the shooting world, somewhere between a parking ticket and a grocery receipt. But the bylaws were the bylaws. Holt stamped the form. Word traveled fast across the staging area. Within 20 minutes, 3 different team leaders had walked past her lane to see the civilian entry for themselves. She was setting up on lane 47, a position at the far end of the firing line, separated from the nearest team by 2 empty booths. A chief warrant officer from the SEAL contingent, a barrel-chested man whose name tape read Driscoll, stopped behind her and watched as she opened the rifle case. Inside was a Barrett Emrad, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. A solid rifle, accurate, dependable. But in a field where teams were running custom-built precision platforms worth $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, the Barrett was a mid-tier workhorse. The kind of rifle a base armory would issue for qualification day, not for breaking world records. Driscoll had been running SEAL sniper training courses for 13 years. He had personally trained over 200 of the most lethal precision shooters in American military history. In his experience, the rifle told you everything you needed to know about the shooter's level. He crossed his arms. .338 Lapua in a Barrett Emrad? For ultra-long distance? He let out a short laugh and looked at the SAS shooter 2 lanes over, who shook his head slowly without looking up from his scope. "Let her shoot," the Brit said. "Someone has to finish last." Laughter rippled through the nearest lanes. She didn't look up. She didn't respond. She unfolded a bipod, pressed the rifle's stock plate against her shoulder once to check the fit, then reached into the chest pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small notebook. Leather cover, cracked and dark with age. The pages inside were yellowed, filled with handwritten notes, hand-drawn wind diagrams, and ballistic tables in faded ink that looked like they had been written decades ago. She placed the notebook beside her on the firing mat, open to a page dense with numbers and arrows. No electronic Kestrel wind meter, no ballistic calculator app, no laser rangefinder. Just the notebook, the rifle, and a scope that looked like it had been mounted by someone who understood that precision is not about technology. It is about the person behind the glass. The sound of the first relay cracked across the desert like a dry branch snapping under a boot, and then silence swallowed everything again. The elimination rounds began at 0800 sharp. 40 shooters on the line, targets set at incremental distances starting from 1,500 meters and pushing outward in 500-meter jumps. At each stage, any shooter who failed to hit the scoring zone was eliminated. Simple, brutal, and public. Every miss was announced over the range PA system, followed by the quiet walk back to the staging tent that every competitive shooter dreads more than a bullet. At 1,500 meters, all 40 shooters advanced. The distance was almost casual for this level of competition, the equivalent of a warm-up lap in a Formula One race. At 2,000 meters, 3 shooters from smaller nations dropped out, their rounds drifting wide in the thermal currents that were already building as the morning sun baked the desert floor. At 2,500 meters, things got interesting. The wind at Fort Iron Hawk does not blow in straight lines. It channels through the arroyos, bounces off rock faces, and creates swirling microcurrents that can push a bullet 6, 8, even 10 feet off course at distance. Teams with electronic wind stations were feeding real-time data to their spotters. Spotters were calling adjustments in MOA, which stands for minute of angle, a unit of measurement that divides a circle into 21,600 increments. At 2,500 meters, a single MOA error means a miss of over 26 inches. The margin between a center hit and a complete miss is thinner than most people can imagine. 7 more shooters were eliminated. Naomi Tsosi advanced without commentary. If you have ever been the only person in a room who believed you belonged there, if you have ever felt every eye in the room measuring you against an expectation you never agreed to, then you already understand what she was doing on that firing line. Not fighting for attention, not proving a point to the men around her, simply existing in the space she had chosen, doing the things she had trained her entire life to do, while every set of eyes on that range waited for her to fail. Drop a comment if you know that feeling. At 3,000 meters, the field thinned dramatically. 12 shooters fell. Wind gusts had climbed to variable speeds between 18 and 25 miles per hour, and the mirage effect was now so severe that the target appeared to shimmer and dance like a reflection on water. A shooter's ability to read mirage, to understand how heat distortion reveals the true direction and speed of wind between the muzzle and the target, separates professionals from amateurs. It is not something a computer can fully replicate. It is a skill that lives in the eyes and the instincts. She consulted the leather notebook twice, turned a page, ran her finger along a column of handwritten numbers, made a single turret adjustment on the scope, fired. Center hit. The ballistic tables in that notebook were not generated by software. They were the product of thousands of rounds fired over decades, in deserts, on mesas, through canyon corridors, where the wind behaves like a living thing with its own agenda. Each entry was a data point earned in dirt and sweat. The tables accounted for variables that most ballistic calculators ignore. The way humidity changes bullet drag at extreme altitude, the way a 338 Lapua's copper jacket expands differently in dry heat versus humid air. The way mirage patterns shift at different times of day as the sun changes angle. Software approximates. The notebook knew. The SAS shooter who had suggested she would finish last turned to his spotter and said nothing. but his jaw tightened. At 3,500 meters, 5 more shooters dropped. The German KSK team leader, a man who had competed in this event for 7 consecutive years and placed in the top 3 every single time, missed his mark by 14 inches. A deviation so small that at any other distance it would have been a scoring hit. He stood up from his mat, looked at the target through his spotting scope one more time, and said a single word in German that his translator declined to repeat for the journalists. Of the original 40, only 7 remained on the line. 6 teams, and 1 civilian woman with a leather notebook and no spotter, no wind meter, and no explanation for how she was still there. The range officer announced the final elimination distance, and the number rolled across the desert like a slow wave of heat. 3,950 meters, nearly 2.5 miles. A distance at which the bullet would be in the air for almost 6 seconds, during which it would drop hundreds of feet, be pushed sideways by wind forces that change 3 or 4 times along the flight path, and arrive at the target with enough remaining energy to punch through steel plate, if it arrived at all. Someone in the bleachers whispered, "No way she makes this." 0847, temperature 104 degrees Fahrenheit, wind variable 22 to 31 miles per hour, humidity 9%. The sun was a white disk burning directly above the range, and the air above the desert floor rippled like the surface of a boiling pot. The 6 remaining team shooters took their positions first. Each one had a spotter kneeling beside them, reading wind data from electronic meters, calling adjustments through bone conduction earpieces. Each team had spent months preparing for this exact moment, running ballistic software through thousands of simulated scenarios at this altitude, in this heat, with these wind patterns. Naomi Sosi lay prone on lane 47, alone. She opened the leather notebook to a page near the back. The handwriting on this page was different from the others, older, more deliberate. The ink was a deep brown, almost the color of dried earth. At the top of the page, a single line read, in Diné script and then in English, "The wind does not lie. Listen." She placed the Barrett's bipod on the mat, pressed the stock into her shoulder, looked through the scope. What she was doing in those 8 seconds of stillness was something that no machine could replicate with the same intimacy. She was reading the mirage. The way heat distortion bends light between the shooter and the target creates visible patterns, like slow-moving waves, that reveal the wind's true behavior at every point along the bullet's path. A full-value wind pushes the mirage sideways. A headwind compresses it. A quartering wind tilts it at an angle. At 3,950 meters, there are at least 4 distinct wind zones between the muzzle and the target, each potentially blowing in a different direction at a different speed. She was reading all 4 simultaneously, cross-referencing what she saw through the glass with the handwritten tables in a notebook that had been compiled over decades of observation in this exact kind of terrain. She closed her eyes. 3 seconds. In that darkness, she was not on a competition range in Arizona. She was on a mesa outside Chinle, the wind pushing against her face, her grandfather's voice in her ear saying the same thing he always said before a shot. The bullet already knows where to go. Your only job is to not get in its way. She opened her eyes, made one elevation adjustment, one windage correction. The first round out of a cold barrel, a barrel that has not been recently fired and has not reached its thermal equilibrium, behaves differently from every subsequent round. The steel has not yet expanded to its stable diameter. The rifling grips the bullet with slightly different pressure. The harmonics, the microscopic vibrations that travel through the barrel as the round accelerates, are unpredictable. Most competitive shooters fire a fouling round first, a throwaway shot to wake the rifle up and bring the barrel to temperature. She did not have that option. One shot, cold bore. 3,951 meters of canyon wind, thermal distortion, and gravitational drop standing between her and a steel plate the size of a dinner tray. Breath held. Heartbeat at 44 beats per minute. A resting pulse that most people only achieve in deep sleep, achieved through a breathing technique she had practiced since she was old enough to hold a rifle. The trigger broke cleanly at 2¼ pounds. The .338 Lapa Magnum round left the muzzle at approximately 2,940 feet per second and began its long, arcing flight across the Arizona desert. For 5.5 seconds, the bullet was alone in the sky, subject to every force the atmosphere could throw at it. Gravity pulling it toward the earth at an accelerating rate that would cause the round to drop well over 1,000 feet from its original trajectory line. Wind pushing it sideways, and not just one wind, but 4 separate wind currents at different altitudes and distances along the flight path, each pulling the bullet in a slightly different direction. Air density slowing the round from supersonic to transonic to subsonic, each transition creating its own set of aerodynamic disruptions. The Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth itself, nudging it imperceptibly to the right over a distance that spans nearly 2.5 miles of curved planetary surface. Every one of those forces had been accounted for in the single elevation and windage adjustment she made before pulling the trigger. Not by a computer, by a woman, a notebook, and a lifetime of reading the sky. The target judge at the far end of the range was watching through a high-powered spotting scope. He saw the steel plate shudder. He looked at the impact mark, looked again, pressed the radio button, and requested a second verification. The second judge confirmed. A third judge, using a thermal imaging camera that could read the heat signature of the impact point, confirmed again. Dead center, 3,951 meters. Cold bore, no spotter, no electronic assistance. The previous competition record, held for 6 years by a Marine Scout sniper team with a $40,000 custom rifle and a 3-man support crew, had been beaten by 403 meters. The bleachers went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when a large group of people all stop breathing at the same time. And then, 20 minutes later, something happened that had never occurred in the 11-year history of the global precision shooting open. The satellite phone on the competition director's belt rang, not his cell phone. The satellite phone, the one connected to a secure military communications network that was only activated during the competition for emergency coordination with range control. The phone that in 11 years of competition had never once received an incoming call from outside the range. The director, a retired colonel named Aldrich, answered the call. He listened for 30 seconds. His face changed. The casual authority that had defined him all morning drained away and was replaced by something closer to disbelief. He lowered the phone, looked at Naomi, and walked toward her lane. The microphone was still live. Every speaker on the range carried his voice. "The Pentagon is on the line. Special Operations Command. They say they recognized your ballistic signature, your shot pattern, from a classified after-action report. Operation Nightfall, Eastern Africa, 2020. The shooter on that mission saved an American ambassador from a confirmed hostile extraction team at a distance that was never made public. That shooter received a commendation in a closed ceremony, and the following day, she was removed from all military systems. No record, no file, no name." He paused. His hands were shaking. "They want to know if you're her." Naomi did not respond. She closed the leather notebook, placed it back into her jacket pocket, and began disassembling the Barrett with the same unhurried calm she had shown all morning. If you figured out who she was before the Pentagon made that call, hit the like button right now. Because most of the people on this range, men who had spent their entire careers in special operations, had no idea they were standing next to a ghost. Driscoll was already on his feet before the director finished speaking. His hands had dropped to his sides, and the smirk that had been on his face since he inspected her rifle that morning was gone, replaced by something that looked like vertigo. The SAS shooter, a staff sergeant named Harlow, was the first to make the connection out loud. He turned to his spotter and said quietly, but clearly enough for the lane microphones to pick up, "Nightfall. That was the East Africa Embassy extraction. We were briefed on it at Hereford. Single shooter, unsupported, neutralized a 6-man hostile team from a concealed position at a distance that the briefing officer called, and I quote, operationally unprecedented. They never told us who took those shots. The file was sealed. Every intelligence agency in the Western Alliance spent 6 months trying to identify the shooter. No one ever did. Across the range, 40 shooters and their support crews were doing the same math. A civilian woman with no military record, no club affiliation, and a mid-range Barrett MRAD had just shattered the competition record by 400 meters using a leather notebook and her bare eyes. And now the Pentagon was calling the range to ask if she was the phantom operator from a classified mission that most of them had only heard about in whispered briefings. In the world of special operations, there is a concept called a singleton operator, someone who works alone outside the normal structure of teams and units. Singleton deployments are rare, dangerous, and almost never acknowledged. The fact that Special Operations Command had been watching the competition feed closely enough to recognize her shot pattern meant that someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had been waiting for her to resurface. The memory came to Naomi unbidden, the way memories always do when the body has just finished doing the thing it was trained to do. A porch in Chinle, Arizona. Dust in the air. Her grandfather, Samuel Sosi, sitting in a wooden chair with the same leather notebook open on his knee, pointing to a diagram he had drawn of wind channels in a valley. Wind moves through terrain the way water moves through rock, he said. It follows the path of least resistance. If you understand the terrain, you already know where the wind will go before it gets there. The old man had spent 32 years as a military contractor and advisor, training shooters for agencies whose names he never spoke aloud. Everything he knew, he had written in that notebook. Everything in that notebook he had taught to his granddaughter on the mesas and canyons of the Navajo Nation, using rocks painted with orange markers as targets and the desert wind as the only instructor that never lied. Samuel Sosi had understood something that most military training programs struggled to teach. Precision shooting at extreme distance is not primarily a physical skill. It is a form of environmental literacy. The shooter must become fluent in the language of the landscape, the way wind talks to terrain, the way temperature talks to air density, the way gravity talks to time. He taught Naomi to sit in one place for an hour without moving, watching how the dust traveled across the ground, how the grass leaned, how the heat shimmer changed direction. By the time she was old enough to shoulder the Barrett, she could read a wind field the way most people read a road sign. Driscoll walked toward her lane. He stopped 6 feet away. She was still breaking down the Barrett, placing each component into the case with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He took off his bonnet, the tan SEAL team cap he had worn every day of the competition, and held it against his chest. He did not speak. He did not need to. In military culture, the act of uncovering, of removing one's headgear in the presence of someone who has earned a level of respect that words cannot adequately convey, says everything. She thought about what it means to be invisible. Not invisible the way a sniper is invisible, concealed behind camouflage netting and terrain features, breathing shallow, waiting. Invisible the way a woman is invisible in a world that has already decided what she is before she opens her mouth. Invisible the way a Navajo woman is invisible in a country that prints her people's land on postcards but cannot pronounce the name of her nation correctly. One by one across the firing line, the shooters stood. The Marine Scout Sniper Team from Pendleton. The German KSK operators who straightened their spines and placed their right fists over their hearts in the Bundeswehr gesture of professional respect. The French Commandos Marine who removed their berets and held them at their sides. The Australian SASR team who stood at attention with their eyes forward. 40 shooters from 12 nations, every one of them on their feet, in silence, facing a woman on lane 47 who was quietly putting a rifle away. The psychological phenomenon at work in that moment is called a respect cascade. It begins when one person in a group publicly acknowledges what everyone else is privately feeling. Driscoll removing his cap was the catalyst. It gave permission to every other shooter on the line to do what their training and their pride had prevented them from doing since she first stepped onto the range. Admit that she was better. The press corps, a cluster of military journalists, and 2 civilian camera crews that had been covering the competition for a specialty firearms publication, broke into a sprint toward lane 47. Microphones out. Cameras running. Naomi closed the rifle case, latched it, and stood up. She turned toward Driscoll, who was still standing with his cap against his chest, and said one sentence. "Your team shoots clean. Your windage calls were 2 MOA off at 3,500 because your Kestrel was reading thermals from the wrong elevation. Recalibrate at ground level, not tripod height." Driscoll blinked. In 13 years as a SEAL instructor, no one had ever diagnosed his team's wind reading error in a single observation. The woman who had been the butt of his joke that morning had just offered him a tactical correction that would improve his team's accuracy by a measurable margin. He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." It was not submission. It was not humiliation. It was the moment when arrogance meets competence and recognizes that it has been standing in the presence of something it did not understand. In that single exchange, Driscoll went from adversary to ally. not because she demanded it, but because she earned it with a generosity that most people in her position would never have offered. She had beaten him, humbled his team, and shattered his assumptions about what a lone shooter with a mid-range rifle could accomplish. And instead of walking away in silence, she had stopped to make him better. Years later, Driscoll would tell the story of that morning to every new class of SEAL sniper candidates. He would tell them about the woman on lane 47, the leather notebook, the cold bore shot that rewrote the record books. And he would always end with the same lesson. If someone offers you a correction on the range, take it. Even if they just beat you by 400 meters. Especially if they just beat you by 400 meters. She slung the rifle case over her shoulder, turned away from the press cameras that were now surrounding her lane, and began walking toward the gravel parking lot at the edge of the range complex. No interview, no statement, no wave to the crowd. The dust rose around her boots in small puffs that the late morning wind carried east, toward the canyon, toward the desert, toward the vast and indifferent landscape that had taught her everything she knew. Behind her, 40 men stood in the sun, watching her go, each one carrying the private weight of a lesson that no training manual had ever prepared them for. Colonel Aldrich found the registration form on his desk 3 hours later. His aide had placed it in a clear plastic sleeve, the way you preserve something that you know will matter long after the day is over. The form was a single page, handwritten in neat block letters, with most of the fields either left blank or answered with a dash. No military branch, no unit, no rank, no sponsor, no previous competition history. But there at the bottom, in the field labeled affiliation, she had written 5 words in small, careful handwriting. Navajo Nation, representing my grandfather. Aldrich read those 5 words 3 times. He thought about the 16 teams that had arrived with support crews and technology budgets and decades of institutional training behind them. He thought about entry number 47, who had arrived alone in a pickup truck with Arizona plates, carrying a leather notebook and a rifle that the best shooters on the range had laughed at before the sun was fully up. He thought about Operation Nightfall, a mission he had only learned about through a classified briefing 4 years ago, and how the identity of the lone shooter had been one of the most closely guarded secrets in Special Operations Command. He thought about how the most powerful military apparatus on Earth had spent years searching for a woman who had been living 40 miles from one of their own ranges the entire time. In the military, the term for a unit or individual that operates without official acknowledgement is a ghost. Ghosts do not appear in personnel databases. They do not attend award ceremonies. They do not exist on paper. They serve, they execute, and they vanish. The operational security around ghost designations is so strict that even mentioning the concept in a non-classified setting can trigger an internal review. The fact that Naomi Tsosi had walked onto a public competition range and performed at a level that instantly triggered recognition from the Pentagon meant that she had chosen, deliberately, to step out of the shadow. Not for fame, not for validation, not for a trophy or a contract or a book deal. For 5 handwritten words on a registration form. Aldrich placed the form in his desk drawer and turned the lock. That evening, standing in front of 2 camera crews from military media outlets, he was asked to summarize the day. He looked into the lens and spoke slowly, the way a man speaks when he understands that the words he is choosing will outlive him. In 30 years of competitive shooting, I have seen records broken, careers made, and reputations destroyed on this range. But I have never, not once, seen someone arrive alone, without a team, without a spotter, without a single piece of electronic equipment, and make the entire world stand up. There's a place in the Arizona high desert where the earth remembers every bullet ever fired. After that day, Fort Ironhawk remembered one bullet more than any other. A single round from a .338 Lapua Magnum, sent across 3,951 meters of canyon wind by a woman whose name was not in any system, whose record did not exist, and whose only affiliation was a nation and a grandfather. The range still stands. The record has not been broken, and somewhere in a locked drawer in the competition director's office, a single registration form sits in a plastic sleeve, carrying 5 words that proved what 40 elite shooters and the entire Pentagon learned on the same afternoon: that the most dangerous thing on any battlefield is not the weapon, or the technology, or the team. It is the person who is underestimated. If this story hit you somewhere deep, then you already know what this channel is about. The next story we're bringing you involves a woman, a blizzard, and a decision that the Joint Chiefs are still debating behind closed doors. Hit subscribe and turn on that bell, because when that one drops, you do not want to miss the first 30 seconds.
If this story hit you somewhere deep, then you already know what this channel is about.